Henry, please.
She came into history, not as a daughter of kings, but as a daughter of ambition, clever, sharp-tongued, and dressed to provoke. When others wore black to mourn, she wore yellow to celebrate. When women were expected to bow, she looked the crown in the eye and took it for herself. She did not inherit power, she seduced it, played it, molded it like soft gold in her hand, until it gleamed in the shape of a crown made for kings. Her name was Anne Boleyn. And if history has ever had a queen who rose too fast, loved too fiercely, and died too beautifully to be forgotten, it was her. Anne Boleyn gave birth to one of Britain's greatest monarchs, Queen Elizabeth I. But before she became the mother of a legend, she became the obsession of a king whose love came with a blade, Henry VIII. The man known more for his appetites than his mercy chased Anne, not out of romance, but out of rage. Rage at a woman who dared to say no, who dared to ask for more than a title, who dared to demand a crown. And when she finally said yes, she didn't just become his wife. She became his revolution, his reason for tearing apart the Catholic Church, his excuse for rewriting the laws of heaven and earth. He burned the world just to get her, and then burned her when he got bored. But let's go back to the beginning. Because Anne's story isn't just about a bloody end. It's about how far a woman could go in a world built to stop her. Before she ever met Henry, Anne was already navigating royal courts, learning diplomacy not from books, but from the sharp-tongued queens and mistresses of Europe. She served Margaret of Austria, studied under the court of the Queen of France, and lived in the company of women who knew how to flirt with power and survive its sting. By the time she returned to England, Anne wasn't some naive girl from the countryside. She was fire in silk, a storm with manners, a woman who understood that to win a crown, you had to risk your head, and risk it. She did. The road to that crown was paved with scandal. Before Anne, her sister Mary had already been the king's mistress, chewed up and discarded like so many others. But Anne wasn't like her sister. She didn't want to be remembered as a footnote in a man's diary. She wanted to rewrite the entire page. So she refused him. Refused the king. And that no made her unforgettable. Henry became obsessed. He sent her love letters soaked with desperation. He fought the Pope for the right to touch her. He broke his kingdom in half to make her queen. And when she finally accepted him, it was on her terms, not as a mistress, not as a plaything, but as the rightful Queen of England. Her coronation was no small affair. She didn't settle for a borrowed tiara. She placed St. Edward's crown, the one reserved for kings, on her head. It was a message, not just to Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but to the world: I am not here to be quiet. I am here to reign. She walked through streets lined with whispers and roses, carrying not just a royal baby in her womb, but the weight of an entire nation's scrutiny on her back. But power makes you enemies, and Anne made more than most. Nobles who saw her as a threat, priests who saw her as a heretic, courtiers who whispered that she bewitched the king with witchcraft and extra fingers. And when Henry's love began to rot, those whispers became weapons. He took other women into his bed. Anne, ever the strategist, tried to control the damage, sending her own friends to spy on him, even pushing her cousin into his arms just to keep tabs on his loyalty. But the court was a snake pit, and Anne's throne was built on sand. Then came the rumors that she had seduced her own brother, that she had laughed too freely, that she had bewitched the king with her eyes. And Henry, who once tore the world apart for her smile, now summoned a French swordsman for her execution. Not an axe too messy, a sword, quick, clean, regal, fitting for a queen. Before the blade fell, she made a joke. "I shall be remembered," she said, "as Queen Anne Lackhead." And she was right. No one forgot. But perhaps the most haunting part of Anne's story came after her death. Her daughter, Elizabeth, rarely spoke of her, but she carried her spirit in secret. In the mottos, she reused. In the ring she wore with Anne's portrait hidden inside. In the fire with which she ruled a kingdom, Anne may have lost her head, but she never lost her legacy. To this day, they say her ghost walks the halls of Hever Castle, or lingers in the Tower of London, a woman with no head, wearing yellow, smiling in silence. History tried to silence her. Her enemies tried to erase her, but Anne Boleyn was never meant to be silent. She was born to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. And tonight, you will remember her too. Long before the sharp tongue, the yellow dress, and the French sword that would claim her life, Anne Boleyn was just a young girl sent away from home with a head full of questions and a heart not yet bruised by the weight of power. She was not yet the woman who would haunt England's royal history, but the girl who would learn how to survive it. And her training ground was not England. It was France. It was the year 1513. And Anne, not more than 12 or 13, was sent across the sea to serve Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Netherlands. This was no small assignment. Margaret was brilliant, cultured, fiercely independent, and known throughout Europe as one of the finest minds of her time. She ruled like a man, but moved like a queen. And for young Anne, this was the first spark, the moment when she saw that power could sit in a woman's hands and not shake. Margaret, it is said, quickly grew fond of Anne, noting her quick wit, sharp memory, and elegant manner. In that court, Anne learned how to listen carefully, speak strategically, and dress with intention. Every pin in her hair, every shade of fabric, every bow of the head, it all meant something. It was chess in silk and lace. But the journey didn't stop there. From Margaret's court, Anne was transferred to the household of Mary Tudor, the sister of Henry VIII, who had just become Queen of France by marrying the aging Louis XII. Anne now found herself inside the heart of French court life. A world painted with perfumes, poetry, whispered affairs, and power plays wrapped in velvet. When Louis died only a few months after the wedding, Anne remained in France, continuing her education under Queen Claude, and within the orbit of the most sophisticated women of the era. These were women who wrote books, argued with bishops, and made kings weep with a glance. Anne watched, listened, and absorbed it all, not just the language, but the style, the grace, the boldness. The French court taught her more than embroidery and courtly dance. It taught her how to be dangerous with a smile. There, in that gilded world, Anne's mind became a fortress. She read the poetry of Marguerite de Navarre, sister of King Francis I, and grew infatuated with her intelligence and independence. Marguerite was not only a princess but also a writer, a philosopher, and a reformist in her own right. Anne admired her deeply, so deeply, in fact, that many years later she confessed that her greatest wish, second only to having a son, was to see Marguerite again. One wonders if that longing was not only for the woman, but for the version of herself Anne had been when she first encountered such bold female minds before kings and crowns, before blood and betrayal. In France, Anne developed what many later called her most dangerous weapon, her voice. Not just her speaking voice, which carried a melodic accent touched by the continent, but her ability to argue, to charm, to hold a room with a turn of phrase. She was not a classic beauty by the standards of her day. Her skin was olive, her hair dark, her eyes piercing. But it was her confidence, her wit, and her refusal to play dumb that made her unforgettable. In France, she learned that a woman could use words the way a knight used a sword. She learned to flatter without flattery, to insult without losing favor, to laugh at danger while holding it in her hands. And slowly, the girl who had arrived with wide eyes and quiet steps became something else entirely, a woman the world would not ignore. But like all golden chapters, it came to an end. Sometime around the year 1521, Anne was called back to England. She returned to a very different court, less poetic, more predatory. Her sister Mary had already become Henry VIII's mistress and was quietly falling out of favour. The English court was colder, more suspicious, more brittle than the French salons she had known. But Anne returned with weapons they had never seen, foreign polish, continental charm, and a confidence they mistook for arrogance. She was no longer the daughter of a minor courtier. She was the woman who had walked beside queens. And it was not long before the king noticed. At first, Anne's ambition was not aimed at the throne. Her heart, it seems, was still capable of something softer. She became romantically attached to Henry Percy, heir to the earldom of Northumberland. The two exchanged vows in secret, and by all accounts, their bond was tender and sincere. But that thread was cut quickly. Cardinal Wolsey, the king's powerful advisor, declared the match invalid, perhaps under pressure from the king himself, who had already begun to set his sights on Anne. Percy was removed. The engagement was dissolved, and Anne, heartbroken, vanished from court for a time. When she returned, she did not return as a girl in love. She returned as a woman with a plan. That heartbreak early, rough, and public may have been the moment when Anne learned not to give her heart freely. If love could be ended with a whisper from a king, then perhaps power was the only safe harbour. From that moment on, Anne's eyes were not on suitors, but on strategy. She would not be another mistress to be tossed aside like her sister. She would demand more. All or nothing, crown or nothing. And the man who would give it to her was already watching. But that is a story for another night. Tonight, as the candles burn low and the shadows stretch across the room, imagine the young Anne, not yet queen, not yet condemned, walking through the polished halls of a French chateau, her silk slippers silent on the marble, her eyes scanning every face, her ears tuned to every whisper. She is learning, always learning. She is watching queens rise and fall. She is studying power the way others study scripture. And though she doesn't know it yet, every moment is leading her toward a crown that will glitter, for only a moment, and a blade that will shine longer than her smile. She will love again. She will rise again. She will walk through fire and wear gold and laugh in the face of death. But for now, she is simply a girl in France, dreaming of something bigger than love, and the world has no idea what's coming. By the time Anne Boleyn returned from France, she was no longer the girl who had left England in quiet obedience. She had become a woman shaped by elegance, precision, and the invisible art of survival. A woman who had seen queens dance with kings and lived to tell the tale, who had studied the weight of power and learned to balance it on her tongue like sugar melting into poison. And yet, when she came back, she stepped into a court already crowded with shadows. Among those shadows stood her sister Mary Boleyn, the woman who had not learned to wait. Mary had taken a different path, where Anne had chosen restraint, study, and silence. Mary had offered softness, availability, and the kind of innocence that courtiers like to ruin. She had already become the king's mistress, perhaps willingly, perhaps not. As the world of Tudor politics rarely offered women a true choice, Mary had been described as gentle, fair-haired, and charming, in the way that a warm spring breeze is charming, pleasant, forgettable, and quickly passed over. Henry VIII had taken her into his bed, given her nothing in return but shame, and cast her aside when he tired of her face. It was this sister that Anne now had to outshine, not just to win the king's gaze, But to redeem the Boleyn name, the story begins not with seduction, but with refusal. Anne, unlike her sister, said no. It was a dangerous thing, saying no to a man who wore a crown, especially to Henry VIII, a man not known for his patience, and even less for his humility. He had tasted the sweetness of women who obeyed, and now he found himself stung by the bitter edge of a woman who would not. Anne did not throw herself at him. She withdrew. She calculated. She stepped back, not out of modesty, but strategy. And Henry, like so many powerful men, became obsessed not with what he had, but what he could not have. Their early courtship was not public. It unfolded in letters, in glances, in courtly dances that concealed agendas sharper than swords. Henry, still married to Catherine of Aragon, was trapped in a royal marriage that had failed to produce a male heir. Anne, refusing to be the second Mary, told him she would not become his mistress. She would not bear his children in secret or hide behind chamber doors. If he wanted her, he would have to make her queen, and so began the scandal that shook Christendom. For nearly 7 years, Henry chased Anne, and for 7 years, she refused to fall into his bed. She dangled herself just out of reach, not as a tease but as a challenge. She became his addiction, and the more he wanted her, the more he hated the obstacles that stood in his way, chief among them, his wife, Catherine of Aragon, had once been beloved. She was a Spanish princess, a devout Catholic, and the widow of Henry's own brother before marrying him. But time had hardened their marriage, and her inability to produce a surviving male heir turned love into obligation. Henry's desire for Anne became the excuse he needed to pursue annulment, but the Pope refused. Fearing the wrath of Catherine's powerful nephew, Emperor Charles V, Rome would not grant a divorce, and Henry's obsession began to tear at the fabric of his kingdom. Whispers filled the court that Anne was a witch, that she had cast a spell on the king, that she was using forbidden arts learned in France. But Henry ignored them. He broke with the Catholic Church, declared himself head of the Church of England, and pushed forward with a reformation that would alter the course of history, not for doctrine, not for faith, but for desire. For Anne, in January of the year 1533, Anne and Henry were secretly married. Catherine had been cast aside. Anne, at last, was queen, but her crown came heavy with resentment. The people loved Catherine. The court mistrusted Anne, and Catherine's daughter, Mary, loathed the woman who had stolen her mother's throne. Anne entered a world where every smile was a blade, and every ally could become an enemy by morning. Her coronation was meant to solidify her place. She did not wear the hand-me-down crown of a queen consort. She wore St. Edward's crown, the very same used for the coronation of kings. It was an unmistakable message: I am not just the king's wife. I am power. I am England. I am the mother of the future. And indeed, she was pregnant. All of it the war with Rome, the betrayal of Catherine, the rupture of 1,000 years of church tradition had been built on the promise of a son. But fate had other plans. On the 7th of September, 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter. She named her Elizabeth. It was not the boy Henry had dreamed of, but in time, that girl would become the greatest queen England had ever known. Still, in the moment, Elizabeth was a disappointment, and disappointments, in the world of kings, were dangerous things. Anne tried again. She suffered miscarriages. The pressure mounted. The king grew restless, and the same game that had once made her queen now threatened to unmake her entirely. Her sister Mary, once discarded, had by then married a commoner and faded into the background. The irony was cruel. The woman who had played it safe lived in relative peace, while the sister who had reached for the crown found herself surrounded by enemies sharpening their teeth. And they began to whisper again. They whispered about her cousin, how she had pushed her into the king's bed to keep his attention. They whispered about her brother, how she was too close to him, how their bond was unnatural. They whispered about her ambition, her arrogance, her foreign ways, and Henry, once deaf to gossip, began to listen. But that is a shadow for another evening. Tonight, let us leave Anne in her golden moment, crowned, celebrated, and still daring to believe in the dream she had chased for so long. Imagine her sitting in her royal chamber, her newborn daughter in her arms, the scent of rosewater in the air, the fire crackling low as the court below feasts and sings in her name. She believes she has won. She believes that the worst is over. She does not yet know that history is already turning against her, that the same crown she wears will one day roll across the stone floor. For now, she is queen. For now, she is loved. And in the stillness of that night, as her daughter sleeps, and her ladies whisper lullabies, Anne Boleyn dreams not of downfall, but of legacy. She does not yet know legacy is coming, but not the way she thinks. There are moments in history when a single colour can whisper louder than a scream, when a choice of fabric can wound deeper than a sword, and when a woman walking into a room becomes more dangerous than any army. And so it was on the day Anne Boleyn wore yellow. It should have been a day of mourning. The court had gathered, heavy with solemnity, for the passing of Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Once beloved, now discarded, a Spanish princess who had weathered humiliation with a queen's poise, who had held her faith like a sword, and her dignity like a shield. Her death marked the end of an era, but not for Anne. For Anne, it marked something else entirely. She did not wear black. She did not veil her face. She did not hang her head in sorrow. She wore yellow, not a soft, pale shade of mercy. No, it was a bold, bright yellow, the colour of celebration, the colour of rebirth, the colour of a woman who believed she had finally won. To some, it was a statement of joy, joy that her rival was gone, that the road was clear, that her daughter Elizabeth could now be seen as the true heir, unchallenged by the lingering presence of Catherine. To others, it was a cruelty wrapped in gold thread, a sign that Anne did not mourn like a woman, nor weep like a queen. It was a scandal woven into silk, and the court, already bristling with resentment, took notice. Whispers began to rise like smoke from the hearths of courtiers and servants alike. Some said Anne had danced that day. Others said she laughed too loudly at dinner. Others still claimed she had orchestrated the moment with chilling calculation, knowing full well what it would say to the world. But the truth, like so much in Anne's story, was more complex. Some historians argue the yellow was worn in accordance with Spanish tradition, in which yellow symbolized mourning and hope for the afterlife. Others believe it was Henry who insisted on the color, and Anne simply obeyed. But it did not matter. The damage was done. The image was set. The queen in yellow, smiling, glowing, standing triumphant above a dead woman's memory. And from that moment, the black rumors began to multiply. They did not begin with logic. They never do. They began in dark corners, behind closed doors, spoken by those who smiled in Anne's presence and spit her name into their cups when she turned away. Rumors that her mother, Elizabeth Boleyn, had once slept with the king, that Henry had not only taken the daughters, but also the mother, that the Boleyn women were witches, séductresses, serpents in silks. The most grotesque of whispers claimed Henry had bedded all three, mother, sister, and Anne, and that the Queen's child might not be royal at all. But the product of something darker, it was absurd. It was obscene. And yet, it found purchase in the minds of those who had always doubted her. Even worse came from Nicholas Sander, a Catholic priest and one of Anne's most venomous detractors. He described Anne as physically deformed, with a sixth finger, a protruding tooth, and moles across her body, the devil's marks. He called them. He claimed her beauty was an illusion, and that her soul was even more misshapen. There was no evidence. There never would be. But Anne, in death, would carry these lies on her shoulders like a second execution. For centuries, schoolchildren would whisper about her cursed hand. Tourists would peer into portraits, looking for signs of a finger that never existed. Anne's response to these attacks was not silence. Not yet. She still had her pride. Her voice, and the king's ear, though, only barely. She responded the only way she knew how, with symbols. Gestures, and a crown that gleamed harder the more they tried to tarnish it. During her coronation, she had worn the same crown that once graced Henry's head. She had claimed it not as a wife, but as a queen in her own right. Later, a new crown was forged, especially for her, as if to say, I will not wear your past. I will not inherit your shame. I am not a substitute. I am a sovereign. But the people were not easily won. They had loved Catherine, and they loved even more the idea of a world in which virtue could defeat ambition. Anne's quick temper, her cutting wit, and her refusal to play the soft, obedient queen only deepened the divide. She was not quiet. She was not gentle. She did not soothe Henry's worst instincts. She mirrored them. Fire met fire, and the court burned with tension. She began to make enemies in every direction. Powerful nobles resented her rise. Old allies began to shift their loyalties. Even the king, once so blinded by passion, began to blink. Anne, once the brightest star in his sky, now seemed to flicker in his periphery. And still, she fought. Still, she maneuvered. Still, she tried to hold together the trembling palace she had built with blood and charm. But charm cannot fix a broken promise. And the promise Anne had built her reign upon the promise of a son remained unfulfilled. The queen suffered miscarriage after miscarriage. The pressure mounted. Each failure was not just a personal tragedy, but a national disappointment. Elizabeth, brilliant though she was, could not replace the phantom son England had been promised, and Henry, forever hungry for legacy and control, began to look elsewhere. Anne knew this. She felt it in the silence between their dinners, in the way he watched other women, in the sudden distance of his gaze. And once again, the whispers began, that she was cold, that she was cruel, that she mocked the king behind closed doors, that she was jealous, paranoid, dangerous. It was said that she asked her cousin to flirt with the king, perhaps even sleep with him to spy on his affections. A desperate tactic? A final attempt to remain relevant. But if it was true, it did not work. Henry had turned. And when a king turns, it is never quiet. Soon, she would face charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Soon, she would be dragged to trial. Soon, her crown would be taken. Her laughter would fade. Her hands would be bound. But that day had not yet come. For now, she still walked the halls in silk slippers, still kissed her daughter goodnight, still whispered prayers to a God who had grown silent, still held her head high, even as the shadows deepened around her. And so, as the night wraps around you like a cloak, imagine Anne not as the doomed queen or the ghost in the tower, but as she was in those final months, still standing, still defiant, still dressing in colours no one expected. The yellow dress may have shocked a kingdom, but it was not worn in cruelty. It was worn in warning. She knew, even then. She knew, and yet she wore it anyway. It glittered. Yes, it shimmered in torchlight and caught the breath of courtiers who had never before seen such a thing. St. Edward's crown, heavy with history, resting not on the head of a king, but on the brow of a woman who had once been no more than a diplomat's clever daughter. But as it sat there, its golden arches pressing into Anne Boleyn's dark hair, its weight dragging ever so slightly at her neck, there was something imperceptibly wrong, something that no one in the cheering crowds dared to say aloud, something even she could not admit. As she smiled and waved from her procession, carriage lined with crimson velvet, the crown did not fit. Not because it was too large or too small, no. It sat well enough, but because Anne's path to that throne had not been paved with love or loyalty, nor had it been granted with the sigh of a peaceful inheritance. It had been ripped, torn, bled from the heart of a kingdom that would never fully accept her. Every pearl in that crown echoed with the sound of Catherine's tears. Every gemstone vibrated with the curses of nobles who still called her concubine, and though she held it as if born to rule, the truth followed behind her like a shadow too long for daylight. She was a queen who had won her crown from a man, not a people, and that man was beginning to turn. It happened slowly at first. Little things, like the way Henry's eyes no longer softened when she entered the room, the way his hand lingered too long on the arm of another woman at court, the way his smile reached his mouth, but not his eyes when Elizabeth was placed in his lap. The child had his red hair, yes, and his bold gaze, but she was not the son he had demanded. Anne had promised a legacy written in swords and sons, and what she had delivered was a girl with the fire of queens, but none of the protection of male inheritance, and in a court that still trembled before the word heir. That failure, however cruel, was a wound too deep for even love to ignore. Still, Anne fought. She did not crumble. Not yet. She strengthened her alliances, placed her own ladies within Henry's private chambers, turned her cousin into a spy, some say even into a mistress. If her husband would stray, better it be towards someone whose loyalty she could buy. She sent letters. She made gifts. She whispered into the ears of those close to the king. She did not beg. She maneuvered. It was all she had ever known. But the court no longer danced to her rhythm. New women had entered the game. Jane Seymour, soft-eyed and pale as moonlight, said little but listened much. Henry had begun to look at her, the way he once looked at Anne, and in his eyes there was no fire, only comfort, predictability, simplicity. Anne had once dazzled him with her wit, her foreign grace, her cleverness born in French courts, but now those things felt sharp to him, like blades in the bedding. He longed for softness, for obedience, for the peace he had lost when he broke England apart to have her. And so the distance grew. Enemies carried again. This time, the child was a boy, a perfect, tiny prince born too early to survive. Some say she collapsed in her chamber after hearing rumors that Henry had begun to speak openly of replacing her. Others claim she went quiet for days, refusing food, her eyes fixed on the cradle that would never be filled. The timing was cruel. The kingdom would never know how close it came to having a male heir from Anne. And for Henry, it was the final crack in a love that had already begun to rot. And still, the crown sat on her head. She wore it as if it belonged to her. She walked the halls with chin high, ignoring the whispered prayers of those who wished her gone. She spoke sharply to nobles who dared slight her daughter. She refused to call Mary by her title, stripping the former princess of dignity in retaliation for old wounds. She burned bridges, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. In a world where kindness was mistaken for weakness. Anne Boleyn chose fear. But fire cannot hold a crown steady. When the hand that placed it begins to waver, Henry began to pull away politically, personally, spiritually. He stopped visiting her chambers. He consulted new advisors, men who had always distrusted Anne's influence, men who now fed his doubt with half-truths and carefully constructed lies. She was too bold, they said. Too proud, too clever for a woman. She was plotting. She was unfaithful. She was unnatural. Henry, now bloated with paranoia and the guilt of 2 failed marriages, began to believe it. Or perhaps he simply needed to believe it. To cast off a wife, especially one crowned with the authority of England's highest relic. A king required justification, and so the justification was written for him in rumours, in charges, in a web of accusations so wide that Anne could not escape, no matter how loudly she proclaimed her innocence. They said she had slept with her own brother. They said she had laughed about the king's performance in bed. They said she had conspired to kill him. It did not matter that these stories were absurd. It only mattered that they gave Henry a path toward freedom that felt holy, inevitable, righteous, and when that path was laid, the crown began to slip. But even as the walls closed in, Anne did not beg. She did not sob. She did not kneel in public squares or plead before nobles. She stood, and when the crown was taken from her, when her jewels were stripped, when her titles were erased, she still held her posture as if nothing had changed, because in her mind, she had still been queen, because, in the eyes of her daughter, she always would be. And so, on the morning she was arrested, led down the stone halls of the tower, that would soon be her prison, Anne did not tremble. She carried herself with the same elegance she had once worn in the courts of France, the same poise that had charmed a king and terrified a kingdom, the same pride that had once lifted a crown onto her head, a crown that never truly belonged, a crown that never truly fit, a crown she had paid for in blood. And as you close your eyes tonight, let the image of Anne remain not in chains, not beneath the blade, but in the flickering memory of that first coronation, when the bells rang, and the crowds roared, and the sun gleamed off the jewels of a crown, forged not for her, but taken by her all the same. A woman who dared to wear a king's inheritance, knowing the weight would crush her, but still, she wore it, because some crowns are not given, they are taken, and some stories, even when broken, never truly end. There comes a moment, in every carefully constructed downfall, when silence becomes the loudest sound in the room, when the chairs have been arranged, the scrolls unfurled, the accusers rehearsed, and all that remains is for the condemned to speak, knowing, deep within her bones, that nothing she says will change what has already been decided. Anne Boleyn knew this. She knew it from the moment the guards entered her chamber without knocking, their eyes averted not from respect, but from shame. She knew it when she was taken to the tower, not as a queen to be protected, but as a prisoner to be erased. And she knew it when she stood trial, in a great stone hall filled not with justice, but with knives hidden beneath velvet robes. It was the 15th of May, in the year 1536. Anne had been confined in the tower for nearly 2 weeks. The tower, where once she had stayed in joy and splendour before her coronation, now held her like a tomb already waiting for its stone lid. During those days of isolation, she had wept. Yes, but not always for herself. She had laughed too, in ways that frightened the women assigned to watch her. She spoke of angels and dreams, of Henry's eyes and Elizabeth's future, her words running like rivers that refused to freeze, even in the cold. And now, she stood at the centre of a trial, charged with adultery, charged with incest, charged with conspiring to murder the king. They had built a tale so outrageous that even the whispered courtiers had trouble saying it aloud. That Anne had seduced not 1, but 5 men, that she had taken her own brother into her bed, that she had laughed while plotting the death of the man who had made her queen. The names of her supposed lovers were listed like poison ingredients. Henry Norris, Mark Smeaton, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Some were friends. Some were mere acquaintances. Some had barely spoken to her in private. But they shared one thing in common. They were disposable. And one by one, they had already been condemned. The court itself was a performance, a pantomime of justice. The panel of judges included the Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, whose voice trembled not from mercy, but from the weight of keeping his head by offering hers. The evidence was flimsy. The dates listed in the accusations did not match reality. One man was said to have bedded her while she was recovering from childbirth. Another, when she was at an entirely different location. But accuracy was not the point. The point was spectacle and submission. Anne stood before them in a gown of black damask, her dark hair covered, her eyes locked forward, her voice clear. She denied everything. She answered each question, not with rage or tears, but with the calm resolve of a woman who knew that truth had already lost its place in the room. Those present would later write of how dignified she appeared, how steady, how strangely luminous, as if even in ruin, she would not surrender her light. When the verdict was read guilty, on all counts, she did not scream. She did not collapse. She simply bowed her head, rose slowly, and said, "I do not say that my opinions be true or good, but I say that they are mine." A final assertion of self, in a world that had stolen everything else from her. Her brother's fate was even crueler. George Boleyn had also been found guilty of incest with his own sister. During his trial, he was made to read aloud a note supposedly written by Anne, referencing Henry's sexual failures. The court, eager to humiliate, forced a brother to voice his sister's most private pain, turning intimacy into ammunition. George, like Anne, met the sentence with quiet bravery. But the damage had already been done. Anne was returned to her quarters in the Tower. She had less than a week to live. It was decided, in a gesture of cold mercy, that she would not die by axe, as was customary in England, but by sword. A skilled French executioner was summoned from Calais. His blade, they said, was swift, clean, gentle, in the way that death could be when it was paid to be elegant. In the days that followed, Anne's behavior became almost ethereal. Some believed she had gone mad. Others believed she had accepted the martyrdom of her own making. She spoke of her daughter, often never with regret. She prayed. She took communion. She laughed softly. At odd times, saying strange things like, "I heard the executioner is good, and I have a little neck," as if humour could somehow dull the steel waiting for her throat. The court moved on. Henry prepared for his wedding to Jane Seymour before Anne's body had even cooled. Parliament passed bills, declaring her daughter Elizabeth illegitimate. The courtiers who once praised her beauty now whispered about deformities. They said she had bewitched the king, that she was never truly queen, that her coronation had been a farce. But history remembers differently. Anne's final words, delivered on the scaffold, were not bitter. She did not curse the court. She did not cry out against Henry. Instead, she spoke of forgiveness, of the mercy of God, of her hope that others would learn from her fall, and when she knelt before the executioner, she tied her own hair beneath a cloth, so that nothing would interrupt the blade. She refused the blindfold. Her last prayer was not for vengeance, but for peace. And then, with a breath, it was done. The sword fell, the crown shattered, and the world held its breath, as the queen who once wore yellow, who once laughed in the face of power, who once dared to demand the impossible, became something else entirely. She became legend. Tonight, as your eyes grow heavy and the quiet drapes around you like a cloak, remember this: not all trials are meant to seek the truth. Some are meant to bury it. Anne Boleyn did not die because she sinned. She died because she was inconvenient, because she refused to be silent, because she wore her intelligence like armor, and her ambition like perfume. And because the world had not yet learned how to forgive a woman who dared to rise without permission, and though they took her life, they could not take her voice. It still speaks in the letters, in the portraits, in the daughter who would rule longer and better than any Tudor king. It speaks in every woman who refuses to bow, who walks into a room and dares to be seen. It speaks tonight, in the stillness between these words, and somewhere, beyond time, Anne stands not before judges, not in the tower, but in memory, and there, no verdict can touch her. It did not gleam. It did not shine. The sword that would end the life of Anne Boleyn was no jeweled artifact. No ceremonial blade forged for pageantry or splendor. It was simple, curved, and French. A weapon crafted not for noise, but for silence. And in the days leading up to its moment of use, it waited, quietly, patiently, unfeeling, like death itself. The man who held it had been summoned from Calais, an executioner of rare skill, one said to be so swift, so precise, that a victim might never feel the steel before the soul took flight. This was the king's final favor to Anne, not a gesture of love, but one of image, a clean death, a foreign touch, a show of control before the end. It was as if Henry, having broken every rule to possess her, now wanted her gone without the mess her presence had created. Let the blade be fast, let the blood be neat, let the people forget. But the sword, unlike Henry, held no opinions. It would not hesitate. It would not lie. It had one duty: to sever the queen from her crown, her breath, her name. And while it waited, so did Anne, locked in the tower, her room stripped of comfort, her windows shadowed by thick walls. She faced each hour as if it were her last. Some days, she wept. Some nights, she sang hymns to herself in a voice that trembled but never broke. Her ladies, loyal to the end, stayed close, though they feared the strange brightness in her eyes. She had become lighter, they said, not in body, but in manner, as if she had already stepped a few inches out of the world, and now hovered between the living and the remembered. She did not speak often of Henry, and when she did, it was not with bitterness, but with a strange detachment, like someone recalling a dream that once burned bright and now faded in the morning sun. She spoke of Elizabeth more, her daughter, her legacy, her fragile thread of hope in a kingdom that now denied her. She will be greater than I, Anne once whispered, and she will remember. On the day before her execution, Anne prepared. She chose her gown carefully, a simple grey dress, with a crimson petticoat beneath. Not royal robes, not widow's black, just grey, like the mist that curls along the Thames before dawn. She took the sacrament. She wrote letters. One of them, addressed to Henry, is lost to time. But some say she begged not for her life, but for their daughter's future. Others claim she said nothing at all, only folded the paper and sealed it with the weight of everything she no longer needed to say. Outside, the scaffold was being built. It was not placed in the usual spot, not on Tower Hill where public executions were held, but within the tower itself, on the north side of the White Tower, a private death, a quiete stage, a decision made not for Anne's dignity, but for the king's convenience. He wanted no crowds, no mourning, no rebellion stirred by the sight of a queen falling beneath a blade. He wanted silence, erasure, and so the sword waited. When the morning came Friday, the 19th of May, in the year 1536, the sky was clear, the air unusually still. The small crowd that had been invited, nobles, guards, officials, stood in uneasy formation, their eyes darting not to each other, but to the spot where she would kneel. The scaffold was covered in black cloth, A small block stood at its centre, and beside it, the French executioner waited, his sword hidden behind his back. A trick of mercy, so the condemned would not flinch. Anne emerged just after 8 o'clock. She moved slowly, but not from fear. Her hands were folded at her waist, her face pale but composed. She looked, one witness said, like a soul already flown. Her ladies followed. Weeping quietly, Anne mounted the scaffold with grace, as if ascending a throne rather than an altar. She looked at the small assembly, met their eyes not with defiance, but with a strange kind of peace. Her final words, spoken softly, carried across the hush like ripples across a dark lake. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. She did not speak of innocence. She did not speak of guilt. She spoke of God, of forgiveness, of loyalty to the very man who had condemned her. Whether it was performance or truth, only she knew, but in that moment, she was no longer the woman who wore yellow, who whispered schemes, who danced in the shadows of court. She was simply Anne, human, mortal, still. Her ladies stepped forward to bind her eyes, but Anne stopped them. She tucked her own hair beneath a linen coif, smoothed her gown, and knelt with practiced grace. The sword remained hidden. Then came the moment the executioner was trained for. He turned to his assistant and shouted, "Bring me the sword," not because he needed it, but because Anne, hearing his voice behind her, would turn instinctively toward the sound. And in that turn, when her neck stretched ever so slightly in confusion, the sword swept through the air like a whisper, and the queen was no more. There was no scream, no struggle, only a single breath caught mid-air, a gasp that never made it to sound, and then silence. The body crumpled. The crimson petticoat bloomed beneath her like a final rose. A lady caught the severed head in cloth and wept into the blood-soaked linen. The crowd dispersed quickly, like smoke after a candle is snuffed. The scaffold was dismantled, the body buried in an unmarked grave beneath the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No monument, no procession, no mourning bell. The sword was returned to Calais, and Anne Boleyn faded from the world of the living. But the world did not forget. Not truly, for the sword may have taken her head, but it could not take her story. It could not silence the echo of her laughter, nor the fire she placed in her daughter's veins. It could not undo the ripple she sent through England, the Reformation, the challenge to kingship, the idea that a woman could hold power, even if just for a moment, even if only to lose it in the next breath. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember the silence of that blade, the hush before the fall, the grace of a woman who stood at the edge of the world and did not scream, but forgave. Remember the sword that waited quietly, not for a queen, but for a legend, and legends, once born, never truly die. In the cold breath of morning that followed Anne Boleyn's execution, as her body lay beneath the floor stones of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, without a monument, without a wreath, without even a name chiseled into the earth, the world above her moved forward, as if nothing had changed. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of it all, not the false accusations, not the quiet fall of the blade, not even the erasure of her daughter's right to a throne, but the speed with which she was replaced. Buried on Friday, forgotten by Sunday, and by Monday, her husband was already preparing to remarry. It is a strange thing to speak of ghosts while the body is still warm. But in those days, after Anne's death, the palace halls echoed with a silence too sharp to ignore. The ladies who once fawned over her now bowed before a new name. The courtiers who praised her wit now whispered about her fall. The king, once so passionately entangled with Anne that he had burned churches, discarded wives, and torn Christendom itself in two, now wore black not for mourning, but for control, and beside him, waiting in silence like a stitched seam in a new garment, was Jane Seymour. Jane, the quiet one, the soft one, the obedient shadow who had lingered in Anne's final months like a pale candle flickering in a darkening chapel. She had said little, asked for less, and watched everything. She was not known for brilliance, not known for fire. She smiled gently, lowered her eyes when spoken to, and offered Henry not the thorns of Anne, but the stillness he craved after years of chaos. And for that, he chose her. 11 days after Anne's execution, Jane Seymour became Queen of England. There was no grand coronation, no thunderous procession. There was only a wedding quiet, efficient, eerily swift, as if the entire court had been holding its breath for the moment when Anne would fall. And now, freed from its spell, it moved again. Rooms were scrubbed, tapestries changed. The Boleyn coat of arms was pulled down from the walls. Her servants were dismissed or reassigned. Her letters destroyed. Her memory exhaled, like smoke from a dying candle. Anne Boleyn had become the bride. No one dared to remember. But beneath the layers of silk and pretense, her presence still lingered. The very corridors Jane walked were built on Anne's sacrifice. The Church of England that made Jane's marriage possible was born from Anne's demands. The red-haired child now labelled bastard in official documents was the very daughter Henry once begged Anne to bear. Every gift Jane received, every title, every chamber, every honour was stained with Anne's blood. And yet, Jane never spoke of her predecessor. She wore her new role with quiet grace, her silence more effective than any speech. To the court, it was a relief, a return to tradition, a queen who knew her place. She sewed, she prayed, she stepped carefully through the ashes of the woman who came before her, and Henry, comforted by her gentleness, called her his true love. It was a phrase he had once used for Anne, whispered into her neck between battles and banquets. Now it belonged to another. But history has a peculiar memory. Though Jane Seymour would eventually give Henry the one thing Anne could not, a son, Prince Edward, she would die shortly after childbirth. Her time as queen was brief, just over a year, and while Henry would be buried beside her in death, calling her his one true wife, it was Anne's name that would echo in the minds of those who survived them both. Because Anne's story did not end with the sword. It moved. It shifted. It breathed inside her daughter, Elizabeth, the child they called illegitimate, the girl they tried to erase. She would rise, not just to inherit a throne, but to redefine it. Unter Herein, England would see the arts flourish, the seas conquered, the faith stabilized, and the very image of monarchy transformed into something glittering and terrifying. They called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, Supreme Governor of the Church of England. But beneath the robes and the pearls, beneath the powdered face and the iron will, was the echo of Anne Boleyn's voice. Elizabeth never spoke often of her mother. The pain was too personal, the danger too political. But in her private chambers, she wore a ring gold, enamelled, with a tiny hidden compartment inside, and in that compartment were two miniature portraits, one of herself and one of Anne, mother and daughter, forever locked together in a secret. No court could undo. Anne had given England a queen, and for that, she could never truly be forgotten. Still, for years, decades, even Anne was spoken of only in caution. A warning, a whisper. The woman who flew too high, the wife who dared to outwit her husband, the witch who danced too boldly, the whore who made a crown from scandal. She became the ghost behind the throne. The cautionary tale girls were warned about when they reached too far, and in portraits, when they were painted at all. Her sixth finger was added by trembling hands. Her moles exaggerated. Her features sharpened to suggest sin. It was easier, you see, to vilify a woman than to admit she had once changed the world. And so the bride who was never remembered became a symbol of power lost, of ambition punished, of brilliance dimmed. But she never disappeared. Not really. She lived on in Elizabeth's laws. In her speeches, in her silence, she lived in the courage of women who refused to be tamed, who refused to step aside, who refused to accept that crowns were meant only for those born with them. She lived in the quiet rage of history's overlooked, and she lives still, in every place where a woman's voice trembles with truth that no one wants to hear. Tonight, as you lie in the hush of your own stillness, imagine her not in the tower, not in the chapel, not beneath the blade, but walking unseen beside the girl who once held her hand. A mother whispering strength into the ear of a daughter destined to rise. A woman without a tomb, without a monument, but with a legacy that could never be buried. The crown they stole from her never truly left her hands, and the silence they forced upon her never truly held, because even a forgotten bride can become an immortal queen. There is a moment in every great silence when something breaks, not with a crash, not with a scream, but with a single drop, a tear, perhaps a drop of ink on parchment, a drop of blood on stone, a drop of memory that ripples through time long after the body that carried it has turned to dust. And in the story of Anne Boleyn, it was that final drop unseen, but deeply felt, that changed the shape of history. You will not find it marked in chronicles. You will not hear it spoken in royal speeches. It made no noise when it fell, but it fell all the same. The moment her head left her shoulders, something deeper, something older than vengeance or politics or marriage or betrayal, slipped into the soil beneath the Tower of London, and it refused to vanish. A seed, buried not in grief, but in warning. Anne Boleyn was meant to be forgotten. That was the purpose of her death. That was the reason the execution was private. The burial unmarked. The letters burned. The name smeared. She was not just condemned to die, she was condemned to vanish, to be reduced to whispers and cautionary tales, to be spoken of only when a woman needed to be reminded of her place. Her brilliance would be recast as manipulation. Her wit would be labelled as arrogance. Her ambition would be rewritten as sin. That was the plan. And yet she did not disappear. Instead, she multiplied, not in name, but in fire. In the fire she left in her daughter's eyes. In the fire that roared through Parliament halls when Elizabeth spoke with a voice that could silence nations. In the fire that pulsed through every woman who watched Anne rise from nothing, from a household of courtiers and uncertain nobility, and take a crown that was never meant to be offered. And though the crown slipped, though it cost her everything, she proved, if only for a time, that it was possible. She does not speak in full sentences now. She no longer needs to explain. She has become myth. She has become warning. She has become echo. They say her ghost still walks the halls of Hever Castle, her childhood home, where the gardens bloom a little too red in spring. Some say they've seen her by the window, looking out over the path that once took her to court, to crowns, to death. Others say she appears in the tower, just before dawn, her figure faint, head held high, as if even in death she refuses to bow. And perhaps she does. Perhaps the very earth of England remembers her more truthfully than the books that tried to bury her. But no ghost, no legend, no portrait can fully carry the truth of what Anne left behind. It was not just scandal, not just a broken marriage, not even a church divided. It was an idea, the idea that a woman could be the storm and the center of it, that she could demand more than love, that she could ask for power and not apologize, that she could speak and not soften her voice. That she could rise not because she was born royal, but because she refused to stay small. It is easy, in the comfort of the present, to forget how radical that was, how dangerous, how frightening. It is easy to forget that Anne Boleyn did all of this without precedent, without protection, without the promise of mercy. She climbed a ladder no one had built for her, and when it broke beneath her feet, she fell. But in falling, she cracked the sky wide open, and from that crack came a girl named Elizabeth, and from that girl came a reign, and from that reign came a new world. And it all began with Anne, with one woman, with one voice, with one drop. So as the night draws its curtain and the air grows still, think not only of how she died, but of how she refused to disappear. Think of the strength it took to smile at her executioner. Think of the fire it took to carry the hopes of a crown inside her womb. Think of the silence she endured, the slander she survived, the love she lost, and the legacy she left behind, like footprints carved into stone. And know this, she was never just a wife, never just a mistress, never just a mother. She was a mirror. She was a warning. She was a beginning. And some beginnings are paid for, not in gold, not in vows, but in silence, in shame, and in a drop of blood too powerful to be ignored. Tonight, let her rest, not in the darkness of a forgotten grave, but in the softness of your breath, the hush of your mind, the rhythm of your own questions as they rise into the night. Let her be remembered not as the queen who lost her head, but as the woman who made the world remember what happens when a girl dares to reach too far. And if you dream tonight, let it be of her not as a ghost in white, not as a shadow in stone, but as she once was, alive, unbowed, and walking through the garden, where the roses bloom brighter because she dared to touch the throne.